Okay, our next speaker, science highlight number 2, is Dave Fritz, and the title is Nonlinear Dynamics of Deep Gravity Waves in the Thermosphere.
Thanks, Bob, and thanks also to the CSSC for the invitation to present some of the science highlights from our numerical work this morning. Before I forget, I want to acknowledge my colleagues who have made this work possible. Brian Lockman and Ling Wang are the heavy lifters in terms of the simulations that we're doing. And Joe Wern and Tom Lund are the major code architects for the modeling studies that I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to talk about results from 2 codes. One is a pseudo-spectral model that solves the Boussinesq Navier-Stokes equations. The big advantage of this code is that it has high spectral accuracy. It achieves very high resolution, very high Reynolds numbers, so it's appropriate to many altitudes in the atmosphere depending upon the scales that you're interested in. It also has the potential to describe with high accuracy instability characteristics and turbulence spectra, including anisotropy and things of that sort. The limitation that it has is that it typically only works for domains that are roughly a scale height or a little bit more in altitude. So in order to address much deeper problems, we've also developed a finite volume model that solves the compressible or the inelastic Navier-Stokes equations. This has similar capabilities for high resolution and high Reynolds numbers, but it offers the advantage that we can address very deep dynamics extending essentially from the Earth's surface to 300 or 400 kilometers. So what did I do with my pointer here? So this upper panel here simply shows one application of the Boussinesq code to shear instability, which is oftentimes confined to relatively thin layers. The lower examples show the temperature field that responds in the atmosphere extending from the surface up to 200 kilometers from a very small single convective plume here, of depth of about 10 kilometers. This wave field is about 45 minutes after the initiation of that plume, and it shows the modulation of that field as it propagates to higher altitudes in the presence of imposed tidal winds. The lower example here simply shows the response at a very transient phase to a tsunami forcing that is specified as a small perturbation at the ocean surface. So this code has very wide capabilities. I'm going to talk, though, only about a couple of simulations that we've done that are a little bit more mature than those results. So let me ask the question, why are gravity waves nonlinear at very high altitudes? Well, large scale and large amplitude gravity waves yield both very large Reynolds numbers, which imply significant flow instabilities spanning a whole range of scales. They also enable very large momentum fluxes, which ultimately must feed back on the wave packet structure and its propagation with altitude. So the upper panels here, is it possible to dim the lights up here a little bit? I don't know that these are easy to see in the back. The upper left panel here shows KH instability that was observed with the very large telescope LIDAR, sodium LIDAR that Joe Shea partnered with some years ago. And it shows shear instability occurring on a descending phase of a larger scale gravity wave. The right image here, thanks very much, shows a picture of a noctilucent cloud, which we interpret to be a propagating gravity wave exhibiting initial indications of a secondary instability accompanying wave breaking. So we see these readily at altitudes of sort of 80 to 100 kilometers, for which the Reynolds number tends to be very high, and for which we would like to have a modeling capability that can achieve these Reynolds numbers. If I look at the lower images, I'm looking at the opposite end of the spectrum. These are gravity waves having very large scales at very high altitudes. The typical Reynolds numbers for these flows are more like 1 to 100, so they're not going to be unstable in any sense of the word. They're dissipating strongly, but one nevertheless achieves potentially large amplitudes and large effects. There's another middle ground here between roughly 100 to 160 kilometers or so, where we expect to have some combination of these instability processes that we see lower down and the larger amplitude responses that we see higher up. And I'm going to focus what I'm talking about today on these regions where the Reynolds number is either very high or moderately high, such that we can still have smaller scale instabilities. So I want to talk very briefly about just 3 highlights. I'll comment on a multiscale dynamics simulation that we've done using the Boussinesq code. This is one of a large series of runs that we've done, and I'll comment about some of the differences there. I'm also going to talk about 2 cases in which we further explore what we call self-acceleration. That's a consequence of the large momentum transport by gravity waves as they propagate to higher altitudes. I'll then also show an example of some of the instabilities that can arise when large scale and large amplitude waves do penetrate from lower atmosphere sources into the lower thermosphere. So let me first of all comment on the multiscale dynamics. Basically, those of you who do MLT studies are, I think, aware that whenever we look, whenever we try to characterize the state of the MLT, we see typically a superposition of large and small spatial scales, and we see a superposition of low and high frequencies. So almost every time you look, you see something modulating something else. And so I'm going to default back to a really, really simple case here, which is certainly far simpler than we ever encounter in reality. And I'm going to assume that we have a stable gravity wave. Amplitude of 1/2 means that it has 1/2 the temperature perturbation necessary to be convectively unstable. So this wave by itself would be stable for a very, very long time. The minimum Richardson number in this flow by itself is well in excess of 1. So from sort of a traditional instability perspective, this wave should never go unstable. I'm also going to superpose that wave with a marginally stable fine structure with its velocity plane in the same plane as the gravity wave. And then I'm going to ask what happens when I superpose these two flows. So the blue here represents the large scale gravity wave. The red line represents the fine scale structure. And you'll see that the velocity fields for the two are misaligned. And that's key to this whole interaction. So this is a movie that I'm going to show. For orientation, the blue lines here are horizontal. So you have to tilt your heads a little bit to the left. Basically, what we have done is align the computational domain along the phase of the gravity wave. So this edge should actually be tilted upward. The gravity wave propagates in this domain from right to left. And this represents the fine scale, higher wave number shear with which the gravity wave has been superposed. And again, I'm reminding you that the gravity wave fields here for the two flows, the gravity wave larger scale flow and the fine structure smaller scale flow, are misaligned. And the tendency then for them is to distort each other as they evolve. So you'll see initially, yes, it seems to be working, that the two flows are evolving very gradually. The primary initial response is apparently the distortion of the small scale structure by the larger scale gravity wave. But as it evolves quickly here, you'll see that in certain regions, it relatively rapidly transitions to instability, and then it follows a progression to finer and finer scales and more complexity with time. We can also look at the flow and see local signatures of instability. Here, for example, you see what looks like a gravity wave breaking at larger scales, but now it's at relatively small scales within this larger scale environment. At the upper right here, you'll also see an evolving shear instability that kind of follows, moves from right to left along this high vorticity sheet with time. So in some sense, this is an analogy to what happens in the mesosphere whenever I have superpositions of large scale and small scale flows. But in this case, it happens for an extremely simple superposition. What's interesting in the other series of runs that we've done with this code and for these types of forcings is that if I change the orientation of the fine structure relative to the parent gravity wave, if I simply turn the fine structure normal to the gravity wave, for example, this flow remains stable forever. So the fine structure has an enormous role on the evolution of the large scale flow as well as the small scale instability processes. So this shows several realizations of this flow, but now in a different field. These are profiles, horizontal and vertical profiles or cross sections of the energy dissipation rate, or epsilon. And red is strong values and blue is very weak values. And again, you can see the individual features of that flow. This is a wave breaking event. Here's another wave breaking event locally. And then this is that shear instability event that we saw at late stages. So the degree of complexity here is not driven by the complexity of the initial flow, which was very simple. It's simply driven by the internal dynamics and the mutual distortions of the flow fields that contribute. Okay, well, let me now turn to self-acceleration. And this is a simulation that we use the anelastic code for. We get the same results with the compressible code. And basically what happens as a gravity wave propagates upward is it grows in amplitude in order to try to conserve kinetic energy as 1 over rho z, to the 1 over the square root of the density. But because a gravity wave packet transports momentum, and that momentum tries to be conserved if the wave packet is conservative, the incremental momentum being constant means that as density decreases, the delta U associated with that wave packet must increase as 1 over rho. So it grows twice as fast as the gravity wave amplitude itself. So as the gravity wave is growing towards instability, the induced mean flow that it drives, because of momentum transport, accelerates the flow that the gravity wave is residing in. So it basically causes a change in the phase structure of the wave with increasing altitude. So this is a time series, again, from left to right. It spans about 5 buoyancy periods, 5 gravity wave periods. And one sees that the wave structure is relatively linear. In fact, the departure from linearity here at early times is because of dispersion, not because of nonlinearity. But as that packet propagates higher and higher, the tendency for the momentum transport by the gravity wave to accelerate the flow in which the gravity wave resides causes that phase of the wave to try to catch up with the phase at higher altitudes. So as that phase structure becomes more and more vertical at the highest altitudes, the gravity wave vertical group velocity goes to 0, the packet stalls, and it exhibits its own instability that is referred to as a self-acceleration instability. Additional simulations of this kind of a process in 3 dimensions show that we get both 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional instabilities as a part of these dynamics. But for these types of dynamics, it appears that the 2-dimensional instability always precedes the 3-dimensional structure, but the 3-dimensional structure accounts for most of the wave dissipation. So let me now turn to large-scale gravity waves that do, in fact, penetrate to high altitudes. And the wave that I'm going to show you was posed to be representative of a large-scale wave that might easily arise from deep tropical convection. So again, large-scale gravity waves can easily penetrate to high altitudes because they have relatively high Reynolds numbers. They can easily achieve large amplitudes because they grow exponentially. And they can maintain sufficiently high Reynolds numbers to enable them to also exhibit instability, even if we're at altitudes well above 100 kilometers. So this, again, is a time series. Horizontal distance here, 60 kilometers, is the wavelength that we've assumed. Vertical distance, you won't be able to see the scale, but it goes from 100 to 170 kilometers. In this case, this wave penetrates as it goes up, and it does not achieve a sufficiently large amplitude to exhibit instability until it gets up to about 150 or 160 kilometers. At that stage, the initial wave has an amplitude of about 1. It's beginning to be convectively unstable. It gives rise to the sorts of instabilities that we expect for the same type of instability at lower altitudes and higher Reynolds numbers. But now, because the Reynolds number here is relatively small, these instabilities manifest at much larger scales than you would expect to see lower down. And because the wave is now damping, it fails in later times to propagate to the highest altitudes. The instability proceeds downward with time, and the minimum scales that you see here in what I define as the turbulence spectrum are now about 1 kilometer. So if you wanted to try to measure these structures of the rocket, you wouldn't look for small-scale turbulence. You'd look for turbulence at 1 kilometer and larger scales at these altitudes. So what happens now if I do not make that naive, put the blinders on, and assume everything is well, that the mean flow does not change? Because again, self-acceleration is going to be very important in this case. If I now allow the mean flow to change in response to momentum transport by the gravity wave, and I show a time series of the evolution of the mean flow at upper right here, the leading edge of the wave packet has momentum flux. It contributes to transport, and it contributes an acceleration of the mean flow at the highest altitudes first towards the direction of wave propagation. So that changes the environment of this excessive wave packet, and that causes a rapidly descending shear flow. And when I allow for this kind of response in the mean flow, I find that I still have instability, but now it's typically confined to much lower altitudes. So I think it's probably very likely that this sort of process, because it seems to occur for all the simulations that we do, small, large amplitudes, large scales, low frequencies, whatever, I think that this probably contributes very often to the very intense shear layers that we often see in this region of the atmosphere. So in summary, current models are now available that address nonlinear dynamics in the MLT and TI for realistic Reynolds numbers. And that's a very exciting prospect for us because it lets us then begin to compare directly with observations. If we can have observations which allow us to sufficiently pose a background state, for example, we'd like to think that we can capture at least the statistics of the smaller scale instabilities and turbulence spectra that arise from that. Gravity wave momentum transport, transients, and instabilities all play major roles in the thermosphere. That's because the mean flow responds very strongly to the gravity wave. Instabilities drive a rapid cascade of energy to other scales within the spectrum, both other gravity waves via wave-wave interactions and to turbulence processes at smaller scales. Multiscale simulations reveal very complex interactions and impacts. And this is especially interesting because we're finding that the fine structure itself, which you would not think to be energetically dominant, actually oftentimes controls the tendency for larger scale wave-wave interactions as well. If the fine structure is aligned with the gravity wave or has some component aligned with the gravity wave, it has the ability to seed wave-wave interactions that do not happen if it's aligned in a different direction. Now, oftentimes, when we look at the atmosphere, there's this inertia gravity wave background. So you have rotary spectra, so you have both components. And it turns out that a rotary velocity shear is actually less stable, even though it has more available kinetic energy than a linear shear, because the orthogonal tendency, the orthogonal alignment of the shear within the rotary wave spectrum suppresses the tendency for instability to some extent. So it's a wide open game here. There are all kinds of things that we don't yet understand, but it's pretty exciting. Finally, momentum transport by large amplitude gravity waves induce very strong gravity wave self-acceleration effects. These can't be neglected. And I don't understand how they can be accommodated easily, although we're trying to work on it with some colleagues, for including these effects in ray tracing models that attempt to describe these dynamics in a much simpler way. And finally, large-scale gravity waves can induce instabilities extending well into the lower thermosphere for sufficiently large amplitudes, and we believe that there's the potential for these amplitudes to arise due to lower atmosphere sources or even the secondary sources that Sharon Vadas has spent a lot of time looking at. Thanks for your time.